It's the Real Estate Podcast, brought to you by ANZ Home Loans for financial well-beings.
And welcome back to another episode of the Real Estate Breakfast, talking property, real estate news 7 days a week. Whatever you are up to on your property journey, no doubt there is plenty of things that we discuss from week to week that you can relate to, as heard on iHeartRadio, Spotify, Apple Podcasts and Amazon. And you might remember on Monday we were talking about a woman. Yes, she moved out of her 4-bedroom bungalow home, this was in Brisbane, and into a 10 by 4 metre flat in her backyard. Now, the reason she did this was that it allowed her son and his partner and their 2 friends to rent her house affordably, and the friends had been living in this mouldy, leaky rental home with rising costs. So using her superannuation, she built the backyard flat for $150,000. And the trend of relying on the bank of mum and dad in regard to all of this is increasing, no doubt about that. A 2020 Productivity Commission report highlighted a significant increase in younger people who, despite moving out, still rely on parental financial support, and many more remain living at home with the savings from doing so comprising about a third of their income. So let's catch up this morning with Caitlin McGee. She's the Research Director from the Institute of Sustainable Futures. And Caitlin, welcome to the Real Estate Breakfast this morning. Great to have you on.
Good morning, Craig.
This whole reliance on the bank of mum and dad, it has unintended consequences, with low-income families less likely to offer this support. And, of course, the financial outcomes now very much depend heavily on the previous generation's assets. And this dynamic is certainly reshaping how and when wealth is transferred, with parents giving financial help during their lifetimes. No doubt something that you have been watching for some time.
Yes, well, I think we can say that the policies of the last 2-3 decades have created a situation where housing is no longer just seen as a means of shelter, but a vehicle for wealth creation. And at a macro level, that's seen kind of wealth shift from younger, poorer households to older, wealthier households. So now we have a situation where we've got a whole generation that's completely missed out on the benefits of the housing boom. Their parents were lucky enough to reap those benefits, but now we've got this very asymmetric situation, and also a situation that really increases economic polarization, because if you're lucky enough to have parents who, had the money to benefit from the housing boom and amass a decent home, then at some point you might get an inheritance. There are many parents who are not in such a good situation to be able to help out their kids, and it's clear that kids aren't able to do it on their own anymore, with housing being so out of reach. So yeah, we have ended up with this situation which is really difficult and is putting pressure on a lot of older people who want to help out their kids, have to kind of think of innovative ways to be able to do it.
Yeah, I think a lot of people listening to the podcast, particularly about this woman who decided to move out of her 4-bedroom bungalow there in Brisbane, as I mentioned, moving into this 10 by 4 metre flat, will be probably thinking, well, that is one way for me to alleviate this massive stress that my children have and just give up the home. Because, as you say, not everybody can do this. And it was interesting to read that article, because the mum said that she felt guilty. And I guess she feels guilty maybe because she's living in this large home by herself. And in the end, she just said, no, hang on, I've got to make this available to my son and partner and friends.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I guess that's it. She kind of looked, even if you kind of just look at it from an efficiency point of view, there's one person living in a big home. There's a bunch of people who are living somewhere else that I think was mouldy and substandard. And I think a lot of parents feel that guilt because they had it better in their day and they didn't have to deal with this kind of struggle. So, yeah, I guess she was just trying to work out what she could do. And luckily she was in a position, because she owned her home, to be able to think about doing this. And I should say, she sort of talked about the benefits too, like it was a bit of a sacrifice. She's moving into a smaller house, but it wasn't without its benefits.
And that kind of sort of brings us on to no question, there is this loneliness as people get older. And a few comments have been made regarding the inheritance from parents about the adult children learning to live with their parents on these separate dwellings on the same parcel of land. What they're doing is, as adults, they're bonding. It's a whole new way of bonding, I think, with parents, and they're fostering this sense of community.
Yeah, look, I think it's funny in a way because it's not new. If you look back at our history, we've always lived in community, in tribes. Some cultures still do it. There's a lot more sort of family connection. But I think here in the last few decades, maybe we lost it. Well, as you mentioned, there is, it's been coined the loneliness epidemic, but a lot of people are lonely, and we do have a lot of people living alone, which doesn't necessarily mean loneliness, but there is a correlation, especially elderly people. There may be women who are divorced and find themselves with not only living alone, but with less superannuation than their partner and, figuring out, how am I going to deal with this? And I think the kind of social connection that this sort of co-living can build is really underestimated. So for older people to have that kind of support, I mean, I think she referred to the fact that the kids help her out with things or drive her to appointments, just having them around. But for the kids too, they've got the support of their mum. If any of them choose to have kids, they've got that great connection with a grandparent. There are all sorts of reasons why these kind of arrangements can work really well in building social connection.
Yeah, and one of the things that we've talked about in the past is particularly with the meltdown of marriages, divorces. And we know historically that women do not fare as well as men when suddenly the house is divvied up. Sometimes people cannot afford to get another home, and that causes a massive problem. So there are more single parents, as you mentioned, and families that just have one child. So I think particularly if these women that end up after a divorce on their own, if they're connecting back with their children, they might be able to find ways of not only living together, but putting their money together to buy homes.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, there are different ways you can do this thing and for different reasons. So as you said, the kind of connection between, single parents and other parents or mothers or, people who can help them out. More people are having one child. Well, one of the reasons that the co-living concept originated, well, I mean, it's been around forever, but there was a movement in Scandinavia to do kind of co-living on a broader scale or co-housing. And one of the main drivers was to kind of improve the lives of children because, they get that sibling experience. They run around like a little tribe. They've got other kids in proximity. And look, there's different ways you can do it. So the example you talked about was a woman who owned her home and then decided to build the granny flat and move out the back. But it could also be young friends co-buying into a home. So, there's the sort of option where one person owns the home and rents out parts, but it could equally be 2 or 3 people buying into a home. I mean, to do that, you need good legal advice, but it's certainly a model that's kind of growing in popularity too, just as a way for people to afford to get into the housing market.
What about this whole modular thing? I know that that's probably not so much in your lane, but it's probably a discussion point that you've sort of talked about because we've done a lot of talking about modular building at scale, which at some point needs to take place just to sort of drive the price down and make it more affordable.
Yes, look, I think there's definitely a potential for kind of construction techniques like modular housing to make housing more affordable. Although I guess in Sydney, like the real constraint is the land price. So it can only kind of go so far. And that's why you see the tiny homes movement, people buying these tiny homes that they can, put in someone's backyard. So yeah, I think there is definitely scope. I mean, there are a lot of little pieces of the puzzle. So there's no one silver bullet to solving this, but there are a lot of approaches that can go some way towards helping make housing more affordable.
You talked about the Scandinavian one in terms of what they were doing around the whole family unit. Is there any other countries that we should be looking at in terms of, hey, they're doing something a little bit interesting? We could probably lend some of that, if not all of what they're doing.
Yeah, absolutely. And it does tend to be Scandinavia or, places like Germany that lead the way. So Scandinavian countries have a whole lot of cooperative housing, which is a really interesting model. And you can have a rental cooperative, or you can have what's called a limited equity cooperative, or anyway, different models. But the idea is that with the limited equity cooperative, you can actually buy shares in the housing instead of having to own it outright. So it gives you a stake and it gives you the right to occupy. And it's basically just a model that is shown to have really good outcomes around affordability, and also kind of, a very democratic model. And we don't have any limited equity cooperatives in Australia. We've got some rental cooperatives. It's a fairly small sector, and it's mostly in the kind of social and affordable housing space, but we could really look to, having more innovative models. I have to say the biggest barrier when you get to it's sort of a question of scale. So if you're talking about, just building a multifamily home on a single block, the biggest barrier tends to be the planning approvals and what the local council will allow you to do. But when you're looking at kind of bigger scale, like, sort of 5+ households going up to 20 households, the real barriers are how do you finance it?
It always comes down to a bit of money, doesn't it, at the end of the day?
Yeah, that's right.
All right, well, great to chat with you this morning, Caitlin. Thank you for coming on to the Real Estate Breakfast, and enjoy your day there at the Institute for Sustainable Futures.
Thank you.
From powerful and up-to-date news to professional real estate experts with the latest property trends on the Real Estate Podcast.
Look, I think they'll certainly discuss a rate hike. The last time they met for a board meeting, they discussed whether to leave rates on hold or whether to hike rates. Given that the underlying inflation rate is a tad above their own forecast, I think that a rate hike will still be discussed.
And that could mean having to search a little bit further out from the inner city, and that is the key.
Absolutely, and I think $750,000 also looks very different depending upon the capital city in which you're purchasing.
It's all very well for you to say, well, can I invest and stand a 3% interest rate hike? Because if interest rates are going up, it is going up to curb inflation.
So it's not that housing in Mansfield or on the Bass Coast is all of a sudden dirt cheap and super affordable. It's just that a certain segment of buyers is leaving the market.
It's the Real Estate Podcast, talking properties from 6 a.m. every day, from every corner of the Australian real estate market. We connect you to the best real estate information across Australia. The Real Estate Podcast.